And I'll hand it over to you, Mayor Deasy.
Thank you everyone for being here. Yeah, I think it is rather appropriate today to be on Indigenous Peoples Day to be discussing the regional plan in the context of history and culture. As we know, we are on Indigenous land, the First Peoples land. In addition, many of the developments and how our city has been shaped historically has been based on segregation, for example, with our South Side neighborhood and many areas in our city. And it's very, very important that we are cognizant of that as we develop the regional plan that will be shaping our city for 10 years to come. So thank you again, and I will pass the torch back over to Sarah.
Thank you, Mayor Deasy, for introducing this. I would like to say thank you to everyone who's joining us today for this special concurrent session of our regional snapshot series. I'm Sarah Dector. I'm the Comprehensive and Neighborhood Planning Manager for the city. I'm the project lead on the Flagstaff Regional Plan 2045, which is our effort to update our current regional plan. And with me today is Mark Revis, who is our Heritage Preservation Officer and Neighborhood Planner. He is at the center of many discussions on the topics that Mayor Deasy introduced for us. And just to give you all a starter on why this is sort of part of Indigenous Peoples Day and sort of a thing on its own, is that the city is hosting, and county together are going to be hosting a series of almost 30 webinars over the next few months. We're taking little bites of a big topic of how do we plan for the future of the region around Flagstaff? And we talk about the Flagstaff region. We are talking geographically about the city itself, Doney Park to the north, Belmont to the west. Doney Park to the east, Belmont to the west, Fort Valley to the north, and Kachina Village and Mount Air to the south. That's how we describe our Flagstaff region. We are having weekly webinars Mondays at noon. You can register on our website as the topics are getting posted on a regular basis. Generally, they are going to be 15-minute presentations with 15-minute Q&A, so they fit in everybody's lunchtime, and so that they are easy to digest. But we have a lot to cover on them. And today our session will be a little bit longer and we'll have a little more time for questions because we are trying to cover a topic that has a good overlap with the work that is being done in the Public Affairs Office on Indigenous issues and the topic of Indigenous Peoples Day. So after this meeting, the recording will get posted to the city's YouTube channel. And we will also have a feedback form that you can use to provide us information on how you think the topic was covered and what else we might need to cover as we work through many, many things related to Flagstaff and the surrounding area. Our next two webinars starting next Monday are going to be on education in our community. And the week after that is going to be the regional economy. So I encourage you to go to the website and register if those other topics are also of interest to you. So before we talk about heritage preservation and our culture and history as a region, I just want to talk about what the regional plan is so you can understand how it fits in this context. So the regional plan is the city's general plan. It's ratified by voters every 10 years. So while it does go through the city council, it also shows up on a ballot and gets an up or down vote. It supports our land use decision making, our 100-year water supply designation, our transportation planning, equity work in the community, neighborhood planning, and many other things that might be discussed in other topics, including in other topics in today's program, including carbon neutrality. It is also for Coconino County adopted as an amendment to their comprehensive plan. So the Board of Supervisors takes this as a major plan amendment and makes sure that the area surrounding Flagstaff has a compatible set of policies and land use objectives that help us all meet these shared goals. So one thing I think that is very unique about our regional plan is that many cities just plan for their city boundary, but the cultural landscape of Flagstaff and the communities and people in it is much broader, and we acknowledge that in the way that we approach this effort. So getting to today's topics of our culture and history, there's sort of two programs within the city. One is relatively new and one is a little more established that bring together different parts of our culture and history. So Rose Toey's program under Public Affairs as the coordinator for Indigenous issues is concerned with the Indigenous population of Flagstaff and the surrounding nations. It addresses our contemporary concerns, issues, and collaboration. It's overseen by our Indigenous Commission, and it has a formal partnership with the Tri-Diversity Commission. The Heritage Resources Program, which we will talk about quite a bit today, is a different program. If you are part of a Native nation, you may be familiar with your Tribal Historic Preservation Office. Flagstaff has a similar office. As a certified local government, we have a Historic Preservation Officer, who is Mark, who coordinates with both the State Historic Preservation Office and can coordinate with TIPOs, or the tribal counterparts across the state. The scope of this program is set by some federal laws like the Antiquities Act, the National Historic Preservation Act, and the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act. It generally applies to sites, objects, and buildings that are more than 50 years old, and very importantly, the stories and people that are tied to those buildings, sites, and other places. As a certified local government, the City of Flagstaff has a formal relationship with the State Historic Preservation Office. And through that, we do formal federal level consultation with Native nations throughout the state. So when there's a policy set at the state level that's done in that formal consultation program, Flagstaff also works on and uses those procedures and how we treat things. Coconino County has a more informal partnership where they work with the State Historic Preservation Office and they work with the City of Flagstaff, but they are not in themselves a certified local government. So all this ties to the regional plan because really our vision for the region is very tied to our culture, both as people and our ecological relationships to the land and the Colorado Plateau in particular. This statement on the screen is the vision for the current regional plan that we have, and we'll be rewriting this vision as part of the efforts that are underway now. So I'll just take a minute to read it. That the greater Flagstaff community embraces the region's extraordinary cultural and ecological setting on the Colorado Plateau through active stewardship of the natural and built environments. Residents and visitors are encouraged and advance intellectual, environmental, social, and economic vitality for today's citizens and future generations. This vision is very tied to not only Flagstaff, the city, but who we are throughout the Colorado Plateau. And the story of our Indigenous people throughout the Colorado Plateau is an important element of this vision. And with that, I'll hand it over to Mark to talk more specifically about heritage resources and how they are managed and administered in the city of Flagstaff.
Thanks, Sarah. You have me on screen or? Okay, thank you. The Heritage Resource Program, what do we protect and how? Just to tell you how diverse our resources are, there are some images here. Based on the National Register of Historic Places, there are 30 historic properties that are individually listed in the National Register. There are 10 historic districts in the region, 3 of those in the county, with the Lowell district being a National Historic Landmark district. Only 3% of historic districts are national landmarks. There's a total of 1,116 archaeological sites in the region, 401 of those within the city boundary. The majority of those are archaeological sites of Indigenous peoples. There are 3 publicly accessible identified archaeological sites and 6 National Register archaeological sites with the addresses withheld. Flagstaff region contains a rich heritage of cultural resources that extends back to prehistory and early habitation to noted cultural change in Indigenous groups within the region. It also includes the movement west and the development of railroads, timber extraction, and milling and ranching, which established the city of Flagstaff. Heritage Preservation Program is most importantly about the people that lived and left resources that still do survive in the Flagstaff region. Move forward. The Peaks, it's a traditional cultural property. Its places are significant to 13 indigenous nations. These properties of traditional religious and cultural importance are identified in the National Historic Preservation Act. The city is a certified local government, as Sarah has indicated, and the county's comprehensive plan and its policies do address the protection of cultural resources. They don't have an ordinance like Flagstaff, but it is within their reviews. Protection of archaeological resources is an essential duty of mine as the Heritage Preservation Officer. The federal and state antiquities laws, as well as the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, are essential to my duties. What's unique about this area is that Eldon Pueblo, Picture Canyon, and Walnut Canyon are sites that promote, they're publicly accessible, they promote preservation, interpretation, protection, recreation, and educational opportunities that further an understanding of our region's indigenous peoples. Again, the reason our sites are kept confidential is unfortunately there are thefts of antiquities, and that is certainly disrespectful to everyone, including our indigenous peoples. I find the dark skies fascinating and extremely important to the city of Flagstaff. Indigenous astronomy was important in tracking time and the seasons. It was important to Percival Lowell in selecting the city of Flagstaff for the dark skies so we could see the planets. The U.S. Naval Observatory west of town was critical and still is in celestial navigation, and it links itself to actually the mapping of the moon done by a Lowell Observatory. On to the next. Flagstaff Region is a case where it was important in the past and is still important as far as transportation trade routes. Indications all the way from California, again, intersecting in Flagstaff, heading down to the south. We have historic routes and corridors from Route 66 to scenic roadways that are all important, that have the high potential for cultural resources. I think one of the most fascinating ones is the Beale Wagon Road that follows the 35th parallel that actually used camels in the routing and transportation of that significant route. Again, camels returning to North America where they first were developed. Railroad corridors, whether they're currently used or are abandoned, such as our timber lines, they're important as well. This is kind of a fascinating site. It's not a district, but it's a site.
Recording in progress.
The Hart Merriam Base Camp north of Flagstaff. Merriam was the predecessor of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and he developed concepts of life zones. And those were significant as far as plant and animal life distribution, latitude, altitude, and other factors. So again, scientific discovery as well as public lands and their scientific efforts, such as the Fort Valley Experimental Forest Station. It's a historic district. Most people think of our Heritage Preservation Program as our historic districts and our overlays. It gets a little confusing, but in our historic preservation world, we have the townside overlay and the downtown overlay, and those are intended to have design review requirements. They're in that concentrated core of the downtown. We have the Railroad Addition District that straddles the railroad, sort of links to the South Side District. We have the Townside Historic District, and we have the North End Historic District. When you look at the map, it gets, again, a little more complex, where you have the overlays, the historic districts, and individually listed historic properties. Those are all in the National Register of Historic Places. On to the next. Being familiar with that core district, on the upper left, we have town site. On the lower right, we have railroad addition, south side, and the upper right. And again, we're looking, what did I miss? South side. Those core are individually, they're not individually listed properties, they're a collection of historic properties. Some are contributing, but the majority of those properties are contributing to the history of the district. They're owned by multiple property owners, where we have something like Lowell that is individually owned. The Museum of Northern Arizona is also individually owned, and the NAU campus is also a historic district. When we think about reviewing historic properties, the best practice for historic and archaeological sites and for professionalism is the U.S. Secretary of Interior standards. And the most applicable one is rehabilitation and its guidelines. When you go to the National Park Service website, you'll see preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction are 4 noted treatments. But rehabilitation allows you to change a property, retain its historic aspects, and to also make sure that it continues use and a vital. So when you think about rehabilitation, that's what we're usually talking about. We want these buildings to survive. On to the next. Coconino County has really diverse historic districts. Fort Tuthill being a military base and housing. As I mentioned, the Forest Service experimental station north of town, and also the Cinder Lake Apollo mission training site, which is actually at Sunset Crater. All you can do is drive by. It's actually not identified, but that is where they tested and did early training for the Apollo missions, and also surrounding that area, other training. I think it's absolutely fascinating that the Flagstaff region was so involved in the Apollo mission. Lowell Observatory mapped the moon. The USGS survey had a lot to do with training the astronauts all the way from being in Flagstaff to Meteor Crater. US Naval Observatory is important to navigation, and they actually produced prototype moon buggies here in Flagstaff and tested those. Heritage resources within the Flagstaff region are diverse and covers the full extent of human habitation. The justification for a heritage preservation program are the many irreplaceable resources. It is the public interest that the legacy of cultural, educational, aesthetic, inspirational, economic, and scientific benefits be maintained to enrich future generations of Americans. That's my presentation. Thank you.
And I'd just like to add too that the piece that we are always interested in seeing shared with the community is that each of these places we talk about have layers and layers of history and culture and tell the stories of so many people in our community. Mark and I'd be glad to answer any questions you have about either the places we've talked about or the program in general, or how it fits in with the regional plan and our relationships with Indigenous people. If you have a question you want to ask, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can see lovely faces. You can just put your question in the chat, or if you look at the bottom or maybe the top of your Zoom screen, sometimes it's a little different, there's a little reactions button, and you can select that and raise your hand. We also are happy to turn off recording if people want to ask their questions offline. So if you have a question, this is the time to ask. while some people may be typing their questions, I'd like to make a short plug for the Heritage Preservation Commission. There will be an opening in the Heritage Preservation Commission next month. And especially since we're presenting on Indigenous Peoples Day, it would be good to point out that the city has a policy in our regional plan to increase the diversity and representation on all our city commissions, not just ones like the Indigenous Commission. And it has been a very long time since someone who was from an Indigenous nation has participated in that commission. And so we would greatly welcome new applications for that role if there are folks on the call who their interest is piqued by the things that Mark has talked about. The commission is one of the few places where we discuss any of that confidential information that that Mark pointed out is so key and in helping protect these resources for the community. I see Chris has a question, and Chris, were you able to unmute yourself?
Yes, I'm unmuted. I'm not sure if this is a question or if this is an appropriate place for the comment. This is coming from a guy who grew up in Hawaii, where the indigenous culture is not just represented in tokens here and there, but is completely ingrained in the culture. And I very much get the sense that that's a missed opportunity in Flagstaff, and not just the missed opportunity, but something that allows us to represent indigenous cultures in an authentic but accessible way that would preserve our history and in general be a good thing. Is there a way to do that better?
Do you want to take that, Mark?
I think it's a matter of trying to get more information out there. Sarah can talk about some of the things we could do formally at meetings. I think people would be surprised at the amount of resources that are here, and that when we do development, we do find resources in the middle of town. And that is fascinating to me. That's something in my career that I was not able to, we might have had a buffalo kill site in Montana, but the fact that this was that concentration of trade routes and where everybody came through and where they settled and where there was agriculture, just the fact that there's metates that they ground the grain with, in a field, there's a tremendous amount of resources that are still here that haven't been discovered and treated correctly.
I think too, it's about the relationship between these two programs. For the first 15 years of the Heritage Preservation Program at the city, it didn't have a counterpart like the coordinator for Indigenous issues. And so I think that what we have right now is the opportunity to really marry that contemporary people and issues to these stories that we know are so critical to the history of Flagstaff. I think that there were in our past sometimes efforts to de-emphasize those stories and to keep this as a border town that wasn't a very welcoming place historically. There's definitely those stories in the archive at the Pioneer Museum. We know that's part of the story of Flagstaff. And I think reckoning with those parts of our history, both during Indigenous Peoples Day and as we're working through these daily discussions at the Heritage Preservation Commission, is important. And we're lucky that we've had some excellent volunteers on that commission who really advocated for that work in the last few years. I will say too that, it may surprise some people, but at the state level, the state historic preservation officer, Kathleen, is extremely interested in seeing that the stories of Indigenous people, not just as historic inhabitants of place, but actually people who belong and who have voice in all the work the heritage preservation programs throughout the state do, is a real emphasis of hers in both her career and in the role that she's taken on as the head of these programs statewide. So this is definitely an area in which our staff gets more training now than they did 5 or 6 years ago. We have better partnerships built in and understanding of how to build those respectful partnerships. And then Representation is another piece of seeing that representation increased throughout the community, and in this program in particular. And then Melissa, who is the county planner, who's on the call today, may want to add a few notes about how Coconino County is hoping to basically answer your question, Chris. Melissa, do you want to chime in?
Sure, thanks, Sarah. And just wanted to point out, and those of you that are familiar with the county's comprehensive plan may know that the county has strong goals and policies related to cultural resources, protection, and also communication with our Indigenous communities. The county is not, like the city, a certified local government, although it is something that the county aspires to become. But we do initiate a lot of contact with Indigenous communities in regard to our projects, particularly during project review and things like that. So because it's a shared document, we use the regional plan very much in our project review. And obviously the county, there's quite a bit of county land area within the regional plan boundary. So we are aware of that and, are always looking for better ways to connect and communicate.
My comment wasn't meant as a criticism, quite the opposite. I think you've got a lot of wonderful things going on. But I'll use it as a simple example. Growing up in Hawaii, every street name was in Hawaiian. And
Right.
if there was more of that kind of thing, which is simple but big, it would become more ingrained. Again, in a respectful way, I think that'd be beautiful.
Street naming is just an interesting point of view too. Even programs in the city, like our street naming program, have made changes in the last, probably not soon enough, but in the last few years that came from our neighborhood planning and our heritage preservation discussions. The La Plaza Vieja neighborhood, which is the oldest neighborhood in our community and is a primarily Hispanic neighborhood historically and in present day, has a significant population. Didn't have a single street name that was named after any of the families in that neighborhood for many, many years. And we changed that in 2017 and renamed one of the streets that had a duplicative name or somewhere else in our E911 system after one of those historical families. And so those are little things like that, like the renaming of W.C. Riles and other locations in the community, we hope come from the stories that we're working to bring to the planning efforts that we do as a city. And also many of those come from the research and other materials that the Heritage Preservation Program produces and shares. So that's kind of that's one of the ways I think it all ties together. Are there other questions that folks would like to ask or comments they'd like to make about their experience in this space in our community?
I'll make a comment. This is Sylvia. I wonder if, there's so many beautiful murals in Flagstaff, and I wonder if one could be commissioned that recognizes that Flagstaff is on Indigenous land. And I know there's the mural that's behind, I'm not a drinker, so I don't know all the beer places, but
I think you're thinking of Lumberyard.
Yes, the one that's right on Phoenix Street. And that's kind of cool about the history of Flagstaff. But if when people came into town, they saw one, to just remind everybody that this is traditionally Indigenous land, I think would be a big step.
And the Heritage Preservation Program encourages murals. Every time there's an opportunity, I would say we certainly have an opportunity at the Downtown Connection Center. They're talking about the history of the area, and I have a particular one that I would like to implement regarding some interpretation and artistic effort down there at the Connection Center. The Lone Tree Overpass also is an opportunity. Again, that's ability to have public participation with that. They are talking about art. Again, Southside Plan Black and Hispanic community and the lumber mills. But again, there's, tell the entire story is always the best way to go. So there's certainly an opportunity there for something even more than a painted mural, maybe more of a mosaic or something a little more permanent and unique. So both those places I just give as an example, and I'm sure there's plenty of other walls. The only thing the Heritage Preservation Program is worried about with like activation of the alleys and murals and artwork in there is the really old buildings with soft brick can be harmed by painting them. So I do review those. So, but there's a lot of walls there that can also be activated with murals and tell the story of the indigenous people.
Yeah, the beautification public arts staff at the city does do a lot of work to ensure that there's coordination when there's publicly funded murals between the commissions. So I don't know if I know the Indigenous Commission is newer, but they've definitely been throughout the years when there is a historic building involved in a mural or another art and activation process, they bring those projects to Heritage Preservation Commission to make sure no harm is being done, as Mark said, but also that it's historically accurate and representative, and to get that kind of feedback. I know they've been talking about what kind of projects might also get that kind of input and collaboration with the Indigenous Commission as well. So there's so many opportunities for those things to become more visible in the community, and to make sure that is a story that's told everywhere we can, and also that the documents we have and the policies we adopt for our long-term visioning reflect respect and the vitality of those things that they provide in our community. Are there other questions? Rose, I'm glad you were able to join us, Rose. Would you like to jump in and add some things?
Yes, I would not mind doing that. I just want to go ahead and talk about, thank you, Kara, for doing what you're doing over at the Murdoch Center. I appreciate that really, really, with a big heart. Okay, well, let's see here. Can you see me? Can you see me now?
Yes.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. So what I wanted to say was that in terms of public art, that's one of the areas that we're working on. And I think one of the things that is a little bit of an obstacle right now for Indigenous artists to compete in some of the calls that are put out for artists is just the amount of paperwork that has to come into the city for procurement. And so I had talked to Eliza about that, and just seeing how that we can maybe somehow look at that, examine that, and see, and make it a little bit to where the city's still covered, but not make it so hard in a way that the artists are used to. I mean, some of the big name artists that know how to do these huge packages, they're fine. And many times they get the award. However, our local artists are the ones that have to kind of jump hurdles to even get through the process. So I think those are some things that we'd like to address. Along those lines, just looking at things as far as streets are concerned, someone had brought up street names, and just getting in touch with how we can, if there's any new streets, to be a part of that process. So things like that are really going well, and there's a lot that we've been able to just really be a part of, and at least begin the conversation about how we can get more input. So this is one of the areas where I felt like really just trying to get Sarah and the regional plan in front of people whenever possible is important, because then when people don't know about it, that's when there's not enough input. I guess that's what I'm trying to say is just that, is just trying, my job is to really help people to know where things are happening so that they are part of that voice. So anyway, that's what I just wanted to say real quickly. Thanks.
Thank you, Rose. And I think you're right that the regional plan, when we did it last time in 2012, equity and thinking about our place historically and both in our future with equity planning was not a big part of the discussion at the time. It was sort of left off to the side and it was pretty minimal. Even though I think people cared about it, I think the last 5 or 10 years have shown us how much more prominent it needs to be in order for us to make progress on that topic. And we've definitely heard support when we have presented to City Council and the Board of Supervisors at the county that they would like an equity-centered plan and to have equity-centered discussions as part of the regional plan. And while we're still in a time where we're not having a lot of in-person meetings, and so we're rolling this out a little slower than maybe we would want to, we are trying to start those conversations with that at the forefront. And when we are able to gather again, we hope that that will bring many people who maybe thought they didn't have a seat at the table before to the conversation of who will we be and who are we now and how do we build a future that supports many more generations of both Indigenous people and all people within Flagstaff to be part of our community. So those are very sensitive and important conversations that we hope attending webinars like this will encourage everyone to find a voice in and to find a seat that they are comfortable taking and representing themselves and their community as we move forward. So with that, if there are no other questions, I'll stop recording.